All right, it's Thursday, March 7th. Yesterday, your quiz was due. I trust most of you have submitted that already. If you haven't, please do. I still give credit for late work. So if you're ever asking yourself, should I turn it in if it's 1 week, 2 week, even if it's 5 weeks late, even if you've done nothing so far, do it, turn it in. If you watch a video that, let's just say you're weeks behind and you just discover one of the key words, turn it in. I will give credit even for late work. That is work. That's always your best bet. All right, let's continue today. We've been discussing the Cold War. So we talked about the two major instances. Well, two of the three major instances in which the Cold War became active. The first was the Korean War, and the second was the Vietnam War. In both those cases, they were proxy wars in which smaller nations stood in for the larger superpowers. The Korean War first, then the Vietnam War. We're going to talk about the Afghanistan conflict with the Soviet Union later on. That's not always appreciated in the United States for its significance, but really the Afghanistan conflict is the Soviet Union's version of the Vietnam War. But for the time being, we're going to rewind once again to near the beginning of the Cold War, and we're going to consider not, in this case, we're not going to look at the conflicts, we're going to look at the political developments of the Cold War. So in Africa, one communist despot after another assumed control. Africa was kind of its own unique issue because Africa was going through a period of emerging from colonialism. The African nations had had enough of European dominance. The Europeans had proven themselves to be incompetent and evil. And so Africa frees itself, but not always with pleasant results. It's, liberty and democracy aren't always, or excuse me, democracy especially aren't always great things because sometimes the people want to do evil. So in Africa, we had a number of communist despots rise and then fall. Not particularly profitable for the Soviet Union, but it did help their overall theme. They wanted to spread communism around the world, and so if it was going to take millions and sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars to install it in Africa for nations that really offered no real value for the Soviet Union, so be it. It helped the prestige. In Latin America, things were a little bit different. Fidel Castro seized power from another dictator in Cuba in 1959. Cuba, which was right off the coast of Florida, became a communist dictatorship and a Soviet ally. Now, it wasn't like Fidel Castro took over for a good government. He, with the help of the people, threw down a corrupt dictator before him. But, finding out that it's not possible, but discovering that you had one disease and it cured another disease, it doesn't help. You still have a disease. That's essentially what happens. But this was a major threat to the United States. You can go all the way back to the Monroe Doctrine, which said that no Europeans were allowed to interfere with the Western Hemisphere. But in this case, though, the communist dictatorship in Cuba sort of grew up organically. Now, it was heavily supported by the Soviet Union as soon as it arose, but it was Fidel Castro who really led the way. So the relations between the superpowers had always been tense. Now with Cuba, it became maybe even more tense. After Stalin died in the early mid-50s, which was its own story because Stalin had inspired fear and terror and such for so many people and so long. Eventually, a man named Nikita Khrushchev came to power. Incidentally, an interesting guy. He actually led in the de-Stalinization of the Soviet Union. He gave a secret speech, which he said Stalin had went too far. It's kind of impressive they had the courage to say such things. But he became the the Soviet premier, while Eisenhower was president. He proclaimed peaceful coexistence. Eisenhower thought that the two superpowers could exist side by side. Khrushchev was pounding the pulpit claiming, "We will bury you." That's who's famous. I think he pulled off a shoe and hammered it, saying concerning the West, "We will bury you." But Khrushchev himself was very cautious of Eisenhower. Eisenhower had a limitless supply of, let's just call it, prestige and respectability. He was the general who had delivered Europe in the minds of many. People didn't cross Eisenhower because people knew what Eisenhower was capable of. Eisenhower was capable of gathering an army and leading it to utterly destroy the Nazis and conquer all of Europe. And so the Soviet premier was respectful and demurred in many ways to Eisenhower. Even Stalin was very careful with Eisenhower, even before the presidency and during. Incidentally, on the side, We mentioned a great Soviet general during World War II named Georgy Zhukov. Zhukov, after the war, was close to dying, not because he was sick, but because Stalin recognized that Zhukov was intensely popular. His men loved him, the people loved him. A lot of people considered him the savior of the Soviet Union, and Stalin, with his usual jealousy and his paranoia, was probably determined to kill him. What kept, in some ways, not always, but what kept Zhukov alive was every time that Eisenhower had any contact with Stalin or made a visit to a Soviet leader, he always asked, "How is my friend Zhukov doing?" And Stalin was embarrassed to have to say, I killed him. And so, because that, Stalin kept Zhukov alive, which allowed him the chance to sort of rise again under the premiership of Nikita Khrushchev. So, Khrushchev was very careful with Eisenhower. Eisenhower was a man not to be trifled with. But that's going to change because after Eisenhower is going to come John Kennedy. And this is Khrushchev speaking with President John F. Kennedy. Khrushchev knew he could bully Kennedy, and he did. He shouted at him, he berated him, he intimidated him. Kennedy would complain after the meetings that he was exhausted because Kennedy lacked the prestige and, quite honestly, he lacked the internal fortitude to stand up to a man like Khrushchev. In the meantime, the Soviets were making important technological advances. For years, the West had always clung to the fact that the Americans were technologically more capable than the Soviet Union. That myth was shattered in 1957. The Soviet Union launched the first man-made satellite, Sputnik. It launched what was later called the space race. Sputnik was not a scientifically useful instrument, but it was a tremendously advanced development of rocketry and of orbital science, and it was a great bit of propaganda. So this is Sputnik. It's bigger than a basketball, but not much. It has large antennas, and basically all it would do was emit a beep, 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 beep. And if you turned your radio to a certain frequency when you were in America, you could pick up the beeping of Sputnik as it flew over the United States. And there was nothing the Americans could do. It was a satellite. It was beyond the range of anything they could do to shoot it down, or anyone could shoot it down. And this terrified America. This launched the space race. The space race was a combination. From a scientific standpoint, it was a competition between the United States and the Soviet Union to see who could be the first to put a man on the moon and to bring him back. From a real perspective, it was a race to see who could master the art of sending things in orbit. And you think, what's the value of that? If you could send a satellite in orbit, you could send a missile into orbit. And if you could send a missile into orbit, that means you could launch that missile from the United States and hit any point in the world, just as the Soviet Union was doing with their own missiles. And so it had an external value of looking like it was for science. But the reality is the space race was primarily a military competition. The Soviets had the early lead, and they developed it. The Soviets were the first to put a man in space. The very first human being to go in space was Yuri Gagarin. And Yuri Gagarin is an amazing man. Obviously, in the United States, we don't necessarily appreciate all that the cosmonauts did. But Yuri Gagarin, brave man, capable man, competent man, first man to go into space. The Soviets were first at a number of important achievements when it came to the space race. By 1969, however, things had changed. Once in the space race, the United States went through a series of programs, Mercury, Gemini, but it apexed at the Apollo program. The Apollo program was the program to put a man on the moon, and the United States eventually did take the technological lead. In fact, they absolutely surpassed the Soviets in every way. The Saturn V rocket, the massive, unbelievably large rocket that eventually put the Apollo 11 mission on the moon, was beyond anything that the Soviets could do. Their N-1 program ended with one of the largest explosions that man has ever created, apart from a nuclear weapon. And to this day, the one thing that everyone who has been on the moon has in common is this: they're American. They're the only ones who have ever accomplished the feat. And here we are some years later, and still, only the Americans have been to the moon. And by the way, important point, they brought them back. The Apollo 11 was the first mission. Neil Armstrong was the first man on the moon. He was assisted by Michael Collins and Buzz Aldrin, as they all were there, although Michael Collins was manning the command module in orbit around the moon. Incidentally, as amazing as the Apollo missions were, it might be the greatest of the Apollo missions was the one that failed to get to the moon, the Apollo 13 mission, in which American ingenuity and on-the-fly engineering and spectacular, cool, under pressure decisions by Jim Lovell and the other astronauts took a disaster and made it a success. So if you ever get to read about the Apollo 13 mission, I very much encourage it. The technology the U.S. achieved led to other major improvements around the world. This is the Saturn V rocket. This is just the largest thing that had ever been launched at the time. Now, rewinding again, discussing more of the political developments. In May 1960, back when Khrushchev was premier, and this is when Eisenhower was president, the U-2 incident occurred. For years, the Americans had flown spy airplanes over the Soviet Union. This is one of the reasons why the space race happened, because of the need for satellites. No one could complain, because every time the United States flew these spy missions right over the Soviet Union could not formally complain, because if they did, they had to acknowledge that, number one, the Americans were doing it, and number two is they couldn't do anything about it. It was embarrassing. However, that changed. Soviets, as they were developing their Sputnik program and other things, developed missiles that could achieve very high altitudes. So in May 1960, the Mayday incident, Gary Powers, who was piloting a spy plane called the U-2, was shot down. He was eventually bargained and returned to the United States, but it was a major embarrassment for the United States and a major accomplishment for the Soviet Union. But this also led to the SR-71 and the Keyhole satellite programs. This is the U-2. It was shot down. I think it was flying close to 80 to 90,000 feet. The Americans essentially said, fine, you want to shoot that down? Here's this. This is the SR-71 Blackbird. It has a speed in excess of Mach 3. It flies at over 100,000 feet in the air. The SR-71 is not subtle. Basically, you shoot missiles at it, and it outruns all the missiles. It was never shot down for all its years of use. It flew many times over the Soviet Union. It was the fastest plane in the world, just a tremendous feat of engineering and creativity, and incidentally, a beautiful plane. There's a story that's told, because the top speed of the SR-71 was unsurpassed. There's a story that's told, it's probably true, but it's still pretty neat, is that many years ago, it was around Los Angeles, there was a small pilot of a little Cessna that was flying, and he was just double checking to make sure his speed was correct. So he called into the tower and said, "Tower, can you give me a speed check?" And the tower said something to the effect of, "You're going 150 knots. That's a little more than miles, but 150 knots. Somewhere on the same frequency, there was a Beechcraft, a nicer airplane, wanted to show off the Cessna, and so he called in for a tower, and tower, I need a speed check. And the tower said, "You're going 225 knots. And Beechcraft certainly felt good because he was going fast. But somewhere there was a squad of, whether it was F-4 Phantoms or F-18 Hornets or some military plane, and they decided that they were really going to show off. And so they called to the tower. Tower need a speed check, and the tower said, "You guys are going 800 knots. That's faster than the speed of sound." And certainly those pilots felt that they were kings for the day. But however, there was an SR-71 that was making a Arizona to California training run, and so the SR-71 decided to really drop the bomb. And so the SR-71 said, "Tower, we need a speed check." And the tower said something to the effect of, "You're going 2,500 knots." And the pilot responded back, "I thought we were going a little faster than that." And it's kind of the legend told of just how fast this plane was. It was never shot down, although the Soviets tried many times. Every time the missiles ran out of fuel long before they could ever catch up with the SR-71. Rewinding again, 1961, again with Khrushchev, again with Eisenhower, the Soviets built the Berlin Wall to keep their people as prisoners. So we had already talked about during the Berlin airlift, you had the problem that Berlin was located deep into the heart of East Germany. And so this created a natural problem, as people from East Germany would go to Berlin on the east side, and they would sneak into the west side. And thousands of Germans from East Germany were becoming West German. And it was a public humiliation. It was a proof that people didn't want communism. They wanted freedom. So the Soviets built the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall was not built to keep people out. It was built to keep people in. It was not a wall of protection. It was a wall of imprisonment. A lot of people fail to grasp that the Berlin Wall was not the Great Wall of China, which was to keep invaders out. The Berlin Wall was a prison wall. In 1962, another major event occurred. It was called the Cuban Missile Crisis. It almost brought World War III. Uh, President Kennedy has received credit for ending the missile crisis, but actually it was a failure. What happened is, now that Fidel Castro was in charge of Cuba and he was communist, he invited the Soviet Premier Khrushchev to put missiles on the island of Cuba that could hit the United States. This was unacceptable to the Americans. Now, at the time, the Americans had missiles in Turkey and in Germany that were all within range of the Soviet Union. We had a clear advantage. The Americans were able to see the missiles on the ships as they were headed to Cuba. The Americans declared essentially an embargo. No ships would come in or go out of Cuba. It was a question of a standoff. Who was going to flinch? Well, supposedly the communists flinched. Supposedly, what happened is the Cubans turned around. The Soviets turned around and never delivered the missiles to Cuba, and so President Kennedy wrote profiles in courage, and everyone said what a great leader he was. What actually happened is that Kennedy had negotiated with the Soviets and had taken our missiles out of Turkey and limited what we were doing in Germany. So in reality, here's what happened. The Americans started with a tremendous advantage. Kennedy gave that whole advantage away, and at the end, the Americans were much weaker. It was a tremendous failure of policy, but once again, I've mentioned this, President Kennedy was protected by the American media. He was an incompetent president who was dominated both internationally and domestically, a real failure in many ways, but he was a myth. He was a myth even during his life. So this also led to what were called the SALT talks that came later, strategic arms limitation talks. These were largely frauds that allowed the Soviet Union to continue to grow more powerful compared to the Americans. Finally, Khrushchev fell. He became more erratic in his old age, and he was removed, although not executed, which was a real step forward for the Soviet Union. And Leonid Brezhnev became the premier. Brezhnev was a force of political stability, but economic stagnation. He was the peak of Soviet power and the cause of their decline. During his leadership, the Soviets and the Chinese experienced a major break. So going into the 60s and 70s, entering into the 70s, you could speak of the Soviet Union and the Chinese having the same essential objectives. After the premiership of Brezhnev, there's this major split. And so at that point, China and the Soviet Union are working at different purposes. This is Leonid Brezhnev. Brezhnev loved to give himself medals. Loved it. He, during World War II, had been involved partially in a really minor, absolutely forgotten battle. He had a book written talking about how it was the most definitive battle of the war, which is not true. He gave himself all the medals. After he died, some of the medals they actually took back because it was such an embarrassment that he had given them to himself. So he was easily bribed or flattered. He had a very high opinion of himself, but that's Brezhnev. Economically, the Soviets did what they had always done all the way since the time of Lenin and Stalin. They continually launched new 5-year plans, and they continually failed. The 5-year plans would have outlandish goals. The Soviet Union will produce this many tractors, this many trucks, this many airplanes, this many bombs, this much wheat, this much oil, this much steel, this much iron. And what normally happened is the people actually leading the factories, they lied, because if they actually told the truth, they could potentially be sentenced to the gulags, which were the prison camps out in Siberia. And they just failed over and over again. Internationally, Brezhnev had forced the U.S. in a difficult position in Vietnam, for which he deserves a lot of credit. He was the one who had made the decision to supply the North Vietnamese, which bogged down the Americans, which led to their absolute embarrassment in Vietnam. That was a success for the Soviet Union. By 1976, America had gone through Presidents Eisenhower and Kennedy and Johnson and Nixon. Nixon resigned in disgrace. He was about to be impeached for his role in the Whitewater scandal, the Watergate scandal. And by he was taken over by President Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford essentially just served out the term. And so by 1976, Jimmy Carter was president, and many in America were beginning to believe that the communists would eventually win. There was a genuine feeling of fear. America always has had the habit of assuming their enemies are more competent than they really are, which, by the way, isn't a bad habit. You never want to take your enemies lightly, but that even extends into the 90s, the 2000s, even today. We usually assume our enemies are almost all powerful, when in reality it's never the case. Okay, we'll continue more with the Cold War tomorrow.